Well, good morning and welcome to our latest webinar for the year looking at urban church planting and our learnings from London. It's great to have you with us wherever you happen to be joining us from. Thank you for taking the time to tune in this morning. If I haven't met you before, my name is Gus McCow and I'm shortly going to be handing over to Craig Tucker, who is our host for this morning. Now, Craig's the pastor of Scott's Church in Sydney. They're a church plant that launched just 5 weeks ago. And Craig is also the Director of Coaching at Geneva Push. Craig is joined this morning by Reuben Hunter and Richard Perkins. So I'll introduce those guys to you just now. So Reuben is a guy that came to know Christ in his 20s, and he was so convinced of the good news that it has led him into full-time ministry. He started at Cornhill, and he's also worked at Capitol Hill Baptist before he moved back with his family to London in Shepherd's Bush to start Trinity West in 2011. He's married to Louisa, and they have 4 small children. And then our second panelist for this morning is Richard Perkins, and he is the co-mission director of church planting. So Richard oversees resourcing, training and support for a dozen church planters, attempting to launch a diversity of plants across London. Richard is also the senior minister of Christ Church Balham, and it's the church of which he was the founding pastor in 2002. Richard's married to Rosalind, who has a number of roles. She works part-time as a GP, she's a full-time mother, as well as being a church planter's wife, and they also have 4 children, something in the water in London. Now, before I hand it over to Craig, there's just a couple of housekeeping matters for you as we kick off. Firstly, this morning's webinar is interactive. So what that means is it gives you the ability to be able to ask your questions to the panel. So we want you to be able to get the most out of this morning. So on the right-hand side there, you'll be able to send through your questions. So they'll be passed through to the panel and they'll be able to address those questions as they see them come through. Second thing as well is just to be able to say thank you to our sponsors, which is EA Insurance. We're really thankful for their partnership with us in pulling off these webinars. So if you have any insurance needs for your church, make sure you jump on to the EA Insurance website just after this webinar has finished. Now, in terms of housekeeping, that is it from me. Once again, thank you very much for joining us this morning. We do hope you enjoy the session. I'm going to bring Craig online now, and he'll be able to introduce you further to Reuben and to Richard. And don't forget, if you do have questions through the webinar, make sure you use that chat panel on the right-hand side. Well, good morning to you, Craig.
Yeah, hey, thanks, Gus. Yeah, and good morning, everyone. Look, today's going to be a real cracker, I think. Of a webinar. We've got 2 guys, practitioners in London, thinking about church planting, and particularly church planting in urban contexts. I think that's going to be helpful for us, not just for people who might be planting in city contexts, but also people who might be wanting to think, maybe you've been in a city church and you're now going to plant somewhere else, and you need to think about what the differences are like. So in all sorts of ways, I think today will help us to be more thoughtful as we think about the mission of reaching people for Jesus and planting churches that really connect with people. So Richard and Reuben, great to have you here with us. I think we can see you and hear you now, and we'll chat for a little while now. I've got a few questions just so we can get to know you and hear about your context, and then really importantly, people are going to start throwing in their own questions and interacting with us. So good morning, guys.
Morning. Good to be with you. It's good evening here.
Yeah. Sorry to keep you guys up late. Really appreciate you doing that. Richard, if I could start with you. We've just heard in the intro, you're the co-mission director of church planting. What's that? What do you do in that role?
Okay, so it's a new role. So I've only been in that role since the beginning of September. I think we've clarified that as a network of churches working within London, we've got twin aims. We want to see churches both planted and established. Richard Perkins is the director of co-mission, and I'm answerable to him. And I've got the responsibility really of implementing our strategic plan. Our strategic plan is that we want to have 60 churches on the ground by 2025, 360 at some point. But the pressing aim is, how do we get 60 churches on the ground by 2025? We've got 25 at the moment, so we've got 7 years to get another 35, which sounds ridiculous. It's ambitious, but when you think about it, that's 5 a year, which is not outside the bounds of possibility. So look, it is, but that's what we're trying to do. So it's my responsibility to try to make that happen.
So is that an Anglican thing?
It's cross-denominational, interdenominational. So The way London works is that it's probably easier to plant Anglican churches north of the river with a diocese that is more minded perhaps to work with evangelicals, particularly Reformed evangelicals like us. Other churches will be FIEC, dual badged, both commissioned and belonging to the FIEC. And the truth is actually since our church planting began to take off, people haven't really looked to a denomination quite so much as perhaps they might have done in the past, because some of what you get for the denomination you get by being part of our network of churches, though it is not our intention at all to be a denomination.
Okay, well, that's pretty exciting. You don't just have a desk job in a head office, do you, Richard? Do you want to tell us a little bit about, you know, have you got any real ministry experience, and what else are you doing there?
Yeah, so look, I guess I came to London in '96, worked at Dundonald Church, which is the church from which co-mission really has been born. Went off to theological college, trained as an Anglican minister, came out to Sydney, did some time at Moore, went back, and I guess I got the nod, and Richard said, do you want to come plant a church in Balham? So that was 2002, so 15 years ago. And then after a couple of years, we multiplied congregations internally. And then I guess about 5 years ago, we took on board a couple of potential church planters, one to plant a black majority church down in Brixton, which is the capital of Black Britain, really, and then another guy to plant in a fairly similar suburb to Balham called Streatham. It's probably less economically well off than Balham, and they planted that. And then I guess for the last 3 years, which has been really the precursor to this current role, I've been overseeing what's been known as the Antioch Plan, which is a dozen pioneer church planters who are honestly just, they're resource light, trying to get plants off the ground. So some funding from, some sort of seed funding from co-mission, £20,000 for 3 years, some input from me in terms of coaching and training, lots of encouragement and the benefits of the promotion of a network. So that's what I've been doing. And then I stepped back from being the senior pastor at Balham in the summer in order to try to do this role full time. And then together with a guy called Nigel Stiles, who heads up the Cornhill training course, we're trying to plant it at Peckham, starting now, trying to gather a launch team at the moment.
Can't help yourself, still involved in church planting. Richard, I'm hearing you say London rather than England or Great Britain. So co-mission has a focus on London. Is that right? And why would you do that? Why would you focus just there?
I think the honest answer is it's where we started. It's where we are. And so I think God has grown us organically. So our first church plants were local church plants into suburbs that were not that far away from where Dundonald was, so that people were travelling to Dundonald. So Balham being 15 minutes, well, probably a bit more than that actually. It's probably about 25 minutes on a Sunday evening away. Likewise, Kingston. It's where we were. I think, as I said earlier, we're not trying to be a denomination. We're also not trying, so not the national level stuff. We're not trying to be regional either, really, though we're concerned about the southeast. We're trying to cooperate together at a local level, because we think but the proximity of London means we can do stuff together and we can pursue the kind of intentional, deep relationships, which means we can do stuff together. And we're trying to replicate churches that share a similar DNA. So we get what we're trying to do. We're trying to do it in the same way. It'll look different on the ground, but certain things will be true of our churches that might not be replicated amongst other Reformed evangelical churches. So, and I guess the other thing is London is completely different to the rest of the country.
Tell me more about that. Yeah.
Well, you just have to, so look at Brexit and the way in which the vote went. The metropolitan area of London was overwhelmingly Remain. The rest of the country wasn't. Politically, it's probably more left-leaning than the rest of the country. So it's a different thing. The levels of immigration here are massive compared to the rest of the country.
Okay, so if you were talking to a young bloke serious about Jesus, wanting to see people won for Christ, what would be your pitch? Why should he think about church planting, and why should he think about London?
I think London is different to the rest of the country, and therefore it is its own mission field. There are particular challenges to being here. So if you're a guy who wants to go into ministry and you want to reach somewhere which is overwhelmingly secular, overwhelmingly young, overwhelmingly international, often, without wishing to be Corinthian in our church planting, overwhelmingly able, then London is a place to do it. Because London is the place to which all of, overwhelmingly the graduates come in order to do their first job. So if you're out in a regional town, you're wondering what has happened to our 20-somethings. The truth is they probably went to university in Durham or Manchester or Bristol, and then they came to London to work as a lawyer or an accountant or whatever. So they're here. They're not here forever, but they are here. And I think that, strategically, sensibly thinking, if we can reach people while they're here, or build on what they've discovered while they were students, if they were converted at university, then churches like ours and Trinity West can send guys out to other congregations in the regions, in the suburbs, who are well trained and able to strengthen the ministries there.
Okay, that's really helpful. Reuben, so if I could bring you in, you're at Trinity West. Can you, particularly maybe for some of the people on the webinar who don't know London, can you just give us a quick picture what London is like as a city? Where's Shepherd's Bush? And I'm really interested in why you planted there and why you ended up in that particular place. Is that okay?
Yeah, sure. Shepherd's Bush is 12 minutes directly west from Oxford Circus. So Langham Place, Oxford Circus, just on the edge of the West End, which would be London's such a diverse place and so spread out that there are lots of places, I mean, where you might put a pin on the map to say that's the center of the city might not actually be the center in terms of culture or business or any of those kinds of things. So the West End, Oxford Circus is very central. We're 12 minutes directly west from there. We're just inside Zone 2 on the tube map. So unsurprisingly, Zone 1 is Central 2, and you go all the way out to 6. It's a cultural, ethnic, spiritual hodgepodge of a place. But there are two very strong demographics here. There is one sort of white Anglo professional secular community, and right alongside that there is a very strong flourishing Islamic community. So the secular community would be culturally liberal, socially left-leaning, really sure that they know that they don't want anything to do with God. And then the other way, the flourishing Islamic community, there are a number of mosques in this area that are overflowing on Friday lunchtimes. And we chose to plant here for that reason, because although there's a strong secular kind of community, lots of Muslims around, there's little in the way of both faithful and flourishing gospel witness. So there was a need for a church. Trinity West, nearly 5 years old. We moved here just about 6 years ago as a family. It was just my family at the start. And it took us about 18 months to gather a core group to launch the new church. And we have about 100 on a Sunday morning. One of the things that I think is, just sort of thinking on that, one of the things that I think is a big challenge for us at the minute is that as a church we don't yet reflect the diversity of the community here. We have about 14 nationalities represented in the congregation, but the area is so culturally diverse, and as you can imagine, secularism that is very kind of fixed, and a Muslim community that knows what they think about things. Those are very difficult. That is very hard ground spiritually to try and impact. So the work here is very slow, and so we haven't yet seen the sort of conversions that we would hope and pray for, I suppose.
Mm, mm. So I'm hearing similar things from both you guys about what a city context looks like: secular, liberal, hostile to Christianity, young, international, able, transient. So Reuben, as you've thought about your area, how has that shaped how you've gone about shaping church, your strategy, and even your preaching? How are you doing things in your church context? It's 5 years on the church plan. How are you doing things differently from if you're in another part of England?
Yeah, well, so I moved in. I'm from Northern Ireland originally. That's why I sound so good. But when I first came across, I actually lived in this area, and there was something about living here that was attractive to me. I liked it. I had a good experience when I was here, and then I moved out to North London for theological college, and then further north into the suburbs, and was there for 3 years. And I was in a very old, established, 300 and something year old church out there. And one of the big differences between the suburban context and the city context is the transience that Perks talked about a minute ago, where people move out to the suburbs to settle and to stay, and they are there and they're not flitting around like trying to see the city and get around all kinds of different things every weekend. And so you could our neighbors around here will be away out of London a lot of the time on Sundays, you know, so that is quite different in the suburbs. And one of the things about preaching in a established church is that not just the congregation, so an established congregation that was used to there being a long evangelical ministry in the church, so they were used to preaching and they liked listening to sermons. But it seemed also that the nominal Christians that were there, and even the unbelievers that were coming as guests of those people, were more socially conservative. That would maybe be reflective of the particular suburb we were in, but they were more socially conservative. They had a framework for the Christian faith, be it from school or having had some sort of exposure to the church previously, and there was a familiarity with the whole church context that just isn't the case where we are at the minute here. I think the framework that says the church has a place in society was present where I was previously. It's not present here, and that means that when you preach, you need to demonstrate the relevance of what you're saying, I think, in a way that you perhaps didn't in other contexts. People, you need to win them in a way that I certainly found I didn't have to in other contexts. And what's also, I think, interesting as I've thought about this is because the Christians because the guys, our church is quite young, predominantly 20s and 30s. Those guys feel that they're being battered for being Christians. So it's a slog. They're on the back foot. They feel the cultural hostility, and I think they also need to be convinced week on week that what we say when we open the Word of God is really relevant for their lives in the real world and then for their mates. So if they're not hearing the relevance for the culture, they're not bringing people along. And so we're not even getting to first base to talk in that context. You know, when you open God's Word on a Sunday morning, not even getting the chance to do that. So those are some thoughts.
Yeah. Can you, just to press in and help us picture how that works for you, can you give us some perhaps concrete examples of, in your preaching or in how church is structured, if you've got to start further back, you can't assume that you've got a hearing. You can't assume that people understand or are familiar with a Christian worldview or the Bible. Help us picture how that would actually change things.
What I would actually do?
Yeah.
I do it really badly, and I'm not very good at it.
It's not what we hear, Reuben, but you go on. You answer the question. That's...
Well, so I think, there's a sense in which the questions that people are asking have been the same since the beginning of time. Humanity has always been asking questions about identity and meaning and significance and that kind of thing. But I think the way that these questions are being asked is different. So if you like, I think the question in front of the question, you talk about the question behind the question, I think the question in front of the question is different. So they're the same questions, but the way they're presented, I think, are a bit different. And we're working with assumptions and presuppositions that weren't even around 50 years ago, never mind further back than that. And I think it is easier in the West now to not believe in God than to believe in him because of things like cultural individualism and a rejection of transcendence in the world, and the strong cultural narrative that I think is particularly acute in global cities like London about personal freedom, and I've had limited exposure in Sydney, and I think it's it's very similar there, but personal freedom is the kind of cardinal virtue of our culture. And so when we are the measure of all things and we have the right to define ourselves and define anything else we choose, and like that is in order to engage with that, I feel like I have to have those kinds of presuppositions in my mind as I stand up to speak, and I'm wanting to try and either put a stone in people's intellectual shoe or get under those presuppositions or ask the questions of those presuppositions to get people to think for themselves and show how those things don't even tie up with their own kind of. We had a thing today in the news, for example, that one of the Oxford colleges, is this right, Perks? One of the Oxford colleges banned the Christian Union from the Freshers' Fair because of their kind of fundamentalist views or something like that, and that kind of thing. That is the liberal kind of cultural liberalism that wants to say, everybody should be free to have their own views on whatever they want to have their views on, but then to shut that down, I would want to be asking questions behind that, trying to challenge that presupposition, that kind of thing. I just don't think you need to do that in the same way outside the city, where those cultural values are really at their most acute.
No, that's helpful. So I'm hearing you say, putting a stone in their intellectual shoes, a lovely phrase. Is it you're tuning into the kind of things that Keller would call defeater beliefs?
Yeah.
Tuning more explicitly into those? Yeah, okay, that's helpful. There is a question, I might throw this to Perks. Perks, I'm wondering whether you have some...
Yeah, so I agree with what Reuben has said, and I do think it's worth distinguishing between how the culture responds to Christianity as a whole and how people respond to Christians as individuals. And so the Evangelical Alliance had a report back in 2015 called Talking Jesus. Now look, it's countrywide, so it's not just the city, it's not just London. But I think what was striking was people's response when asked about Christians. So I don't know whether Gus has got the slide, but I think if you look at slide 6, if you get that up. So so I agree with what Reuben's saying. It's just very interesting that when when non-Christians were asked about their Christian friends, the positive stuff they had to say about people: friendly, caring, good humoured, generous, encouraging, and hopeful. Look at the stats there, overwhelmingly positive. But then you get to narrow-minded, hypocritical, uptight, homophobic. Now, what does that look like in practice? I think on an individual basis, people don't mind Christians. And if you can get past the kind of initial response, you're one of those people. On an individual basis, people's response seems to be a warm one. The trouble is, there is this tyranny of the culture, which is what Reuben, I think, has described, where, in one sense, when we think of ourselves as part of a whole, there is this sort of growing negativity towards the Christian faith, which manifests itself in like banning a bunch load of students from advertising what's available in their churches. But I think it's easy for us to think, oh, look, this is an absolute nightmare. You know, we just need to hunker down and just wait until the times change or whatever. But actually, I think it's true, it's hard to be a Christian at the moment, and we don't do well in the press. But actually, on an individual basis, there's real encouragement for us to keep pressing on with evangelism, in the hope that on a one-to-one basis, people actually be warned about what they experience.
I'm feeling more optimistic about going into the day and rubbing shoulders with people just hearing you say that, Perks. That's a helpful way of breaking things down. Perks, for you, if you think about the church plants you've personally been involved in, the ones that you see, how do you think churches in a city context need to do things differently, need to have different strategies from churches in other contexts in other parts of England?
I think, in my thinking, it's probably, you can distinguish, as Reuben has, between London and zones 1 to 3 and zones 4 to 6. 4 to 6 are essentially suburban. Zones 1 to 3 a bit different. I think I'd probably want to distinguish that even further and say you've clearly got some city centre churches, and we've tried to launch those. We've tried to launch them not at scale, and they take a while to grow. But in one sense, you know, every church is trying to work out what is our growth dynamic, what is the way in which we connect with an unbelieving community such that we can have gospel conversations and people can come to faith. If you start with low numbers, because of the churn that's been described, the truth is, probably in zones 1 and 2, perhaps zone 1, a third of your congregation will walk away at the end of the year because that's just the migration pattern of being in London. So you've got to grow by a third every time just to stay the same. That's hard. But you've got to factor that in. I think where I was in Balham for 15 years, I used to work on the assumption that if people arrived at 22 as a young graduate, I've got them for 5 years. If they're Christian, okay, well, they'll leave in 5 years and they'll go to the regions or they'll go to the suburbs. What's my responsibility and our responsibility as elders in terms of inputting into them? What do we want them to know? Who do we want them to be? Such that they're a real blessing to the ministry where they end up. But you've got to factor that in. It means you've got to have a training mentality amongst Christians, because you know the whole time your small group leaders are moving on. You haven't got a small group leader for 10 years. You've got a small group leader for a 3-year window, and therefore get them up to speed, put them to work, and then they'll move on. So you've got to have a training culture in there from day one. That's absolutely crucial, because the guys you start with probably won't be there in 3 years. Go on. Is there other stuff you're particularly thinking?
No, that's really helpful. So you want to engage people to train them earlier than you might otherwise do in a suburban context, and I guess you're doing that with an intentionality that they're going to go and be useful for the kingdom somewhere else. Do you how does your congregation get weary of that churn, that transience? How do you deal with that? I'm interested in both you guys. Actually, no, I've got a question first of all. Before we move on to talk about those details, Perks, particularly for you, but you, Reuben, a bit, as a question come in, how would you compare church planning in the UK, and maybe particularly UK with Australia, and how would you compare, you know, London with Sydney? We've talked about what cities are like. Do you see any similarities or differences?
So comparing church planting in Sydney, church planting in the UK, in London. I think you guys are better at it. Yeah, I think you guys are better at it. I think there is more of a culture of aspiration that I detected when I was there back in May to want to be a church planter. So you have a selection process by which you'll get guys who come to you and say, I'd like to church plant, and you put them through a rigorous selection procedure, and you go with the guys you think are well equipped to do that, and that is fantastic. I think in our culture we are risk averse. There's still a predominant model of church planting, which is more akin to revitalization than it is actually either pioneering church planting or congregational planting, sort of hive-off stuff, which means that actually, if you could get employed by a church that is on its knees, but it's got historic resources, it comes with a building, and we are a risk-averse culture, so we're more drawn to that. And so I'm having to have conversations with people who ought to be church planting, could be church planting, don't want to church planting, and have to try and persuade them that this is something that they ought to be doing. Or sometimes we're wonderfully working with people who don't fit the perfect profile of the church planter and say, look, we'll support you. We'll work with what you are. We're all imperfect. Let's give it a go. So I think there's that. I think from my experience in Sydney when I was there, you guys have got buildings that the diocese makes available, and that's a different style of church plant. So I saw some very wonderful church plants with some terrific buildings from which they could base their ministries. And both Reuben and I church planted, having to hire and locate every venue that we did something in if it wasn't our home. That's okay. Different.
Yeah, so a lot of our guys will actually need to hire as well, and they won't all be Anglican, just to pick up the diocese word there. But that makes sense. Reuben, you've been in a couple of different contexts. Anything to say about what might not translate, how London might be different from Sydney?
I don't really know enough about Sydney to say. I think one of the big differences, I agree with Perks when he says that we're risk averse over here. That's true, and there's definitely a reserved politeness that is culturally well known that is beautifully lacking in Australia, which means that there's a zeal and an energy there that just sort of seems to come naturally, and those are cultural observations. I don't know enough about the planting scene in Sydney.
No, that's okay. Another question that's come in is Perks, you talked really helpfully about you've got a 5-year window with those young graduates who come to church in an urban context. What do you really want to, if you've got 5 years with them, what are the things you want to pour into them most of all? What are your priorities in how you want to shape them, how you want to train them? Both of you on here. Yep. Richard,
let me go back to just very briefly to the previous question. I think when I was there and I saw...
You mean Sydney?
When I saw the church plants that I saw, it's somewhat provocative, but I came away saying, the guys in Sydney have worked out a way of growing their church plants that does not depend on outstanding preaching, which is not to say that I heard rubbish sermons, but they were 7 out of 10s, So I learned and I benefited, and it was brilliant. But it wasn't outstanding preaching.
Punchy.
But your church is growing, a little bit. Which is not to say we do it any better, but it was striking, and I think what was key was there was an intentionality about what you were doing that we're slow to latch onto. Okay. And part of your intentionality had to do both with mission, evangelism, secondly, welcoming, and those I thought were 2 key features that we are slower to incorporate. So that for us, there is still a sort of predominant mindset within Reformed evangelicalism, which is not only that the Bible is the heart, and the Bible teaching is the heart of what we're about. There's a danger in which we make it a whole. So it's the kind of field of dreams approach to church planting. If I prepare a knockout sermon on Mark 4, build it, they will come. And the truth is, they're not, because there's a whole bunch of people out there who couldn't care less what's going on. And you guys were more intentional about that. And I think I came back thinking we've got to learn from you. But
all the 6 out of 10, 7 out of 10 preachers on the webinar, you've really got their attention, including me. So that's helpful. So just to hear that, you're saying if the preaching is passable and we're intentional about welcoming and evangelism, that you're observing that being a key mix. Reuben, did you want to chip in on that?
So interest, I agree with Perks about the build it and they will come model, and there's definitely, I definitely think that the kind of Reformed conviction about the centrality of preaching and the ministry does lead us to that point very quickly at the expense of other things. I agree with that. And one of the things that we sought to do at the beginning was, again, to pick up on something that Perk said earlier with regards to those statistics about the culture. Our evangelistic approach locally, we've tried to have a very focused approach to our outreach, our evangelistic kind of approach into this local community. So we've sort of set something to aim at in terms of the local area, and that thing about building meaningful relationships with unbelievers is something that has just been vital, and all of the fruitful stuff that has happened evangelistically has come out of people investing meaningfully in those relationships, because they can reject the concepts that they don't really know too much about actually, but they've picked up in the culture, but they find it much more difficult if they've got meaningful relationships with Christians. And I think engaging newcomers who come to visit, having a really good welcome and having really kind of like the other elements of church life in terms of our interface with unbelievers, new people, visitors, and so on, and unbelievers that come along, and being able to speak to them in a kind of natural and engaged way has been something we've sought to work on. I don't think we've done it particularly well. You might say we've done it sort of 7 out of 10, but I think Perks is dead right there. I think making the sermon everything is a mistake, while still wanting to keep it central.
Yeah, it's the heart, not the whole.
That's helpful, yeah. So I do want to get back to that question about training in a moment, but Reuben, just to sort of again help us think about that. So what's working for you guys in terms of engaging the newcomer? They're coming in, and what I'm hearing is they're iffy about Christianity. They don't know much about Christianity. They might know a couple of Christians who they think are all right, but they've got some preconceptions about Christianity. What are you hoping, what are you aspiring to do in the way you engage them, perhaps on that first Sunday, but also going forward? What are you actually doing?
Well, starting with our own people, we've sought to equip them to engage people's kind of the phrase you use, Keller's phrase about defeater beliefs. We've sought to sort of equip people to engage at a presuppositional level as a sort of just a strategic first step for them, but then also to be intentional about, when we started, we gathered a core group of people, all of whom moved into this local area to be part of the church, because we did have this local focus. And what we were saying was to try and create a strategic approach to not just meeting your neighbours, not just trying to build relationships with people that live in this area, but trying to, as soon as possible, connect them with other Christians in the church, so that when it comes to, hey, do you want to come along to this event, or hey, do you want to come to this carol service, or this thing we're doing at the pub, and they're tempted to say, oh no, that feels a bit weird, you can say, oh, such and such and such and such and such and such as well, and so you're actually coming with multiple people you have existing relationships with. And we've seen some good fruit for that. The first 2 people that were converted in the church came from a very sort of intentional, strategic relationship building with more than just one believer. What I was noticing was that most of the people in the churches that I'd worked in, they would share the gospel with their colleagues, they would share the gospel with their neighbours, and they might build up to that point, but really after if there was no sort of tangible response, they were kind of stuck, and they were left at that point, and just try and share the gospel again, or will I invite them another time, or whatever. And this was I felt like we were trying to create something that was going to increase the ongoing contact with the distinctive lives of the Christian community, you know. Now, I don't know how, truth be told, I don't know how feasible that's going to be long term because of this transient thing. We haven't had, in the 5 years we've been here, of the 22 people that formed our initial core group, 18 are still with us after 5 years. You know, but the reality is they're good. They are going to move on. And I was talking to Perks earlier about the fact that, you know, he was saying, you know, give them. You start off thinking, you know, well, here's a Keller sermon about raising your kids in the city. You know, do you want to buy into this great vision for city life and so on? But it's just a basic fact of life that even godly people will you know, want a change of life and want to move out of the city and so on. So it's been fruitful for us so far to try that, but it's not going to be. When we start to see the turnover that Perks was talking about, I don't know that we'll be able to continue to sustain the sort of the energy that's required to keep envisioning people to do that kind of thing.
Okay, yeah, no, that's helpful. Let me go back to that earlier question about if you've then got someone for say 5 years. What are you how are you training them? Is it just the sermon? What else are you doing to train people? And what particularly do you want to, you know, pour into them? What do you want to equip them? How do you want to equip them? So maybe Perks first. Yep.
Yeah, the first thing to say is that the biblical training is much more than an information download, just exchanged from the Bible or from great Reformed theology into teaching material and then sort of downloaded into their brains. It's more than that. It's modelling the Christian life. It's modelling healthy local church participation. It's wanting to encourage them in personal godliness and growth and maturity. It's wanting them to be engaged and have a heart for the unbeliever. So it's a way of life. So I think in the early days of Christchurch Balham, there's lots that we didn't do well. There's lots that we didn't have written up well. You could have gone to other places in the city and got better education, Christian-wise, in terms of your training. But there was something about being part of a church community where community life really mattered, where there was an intentionality about trying to reach people with the Bible. And although we may not have been able to help them know one end of Mark's gospel from the other, what we were able to do is say, you are part of a community here that loves and serves one another. We're concerned for each other's personal godliness. There's accountability. We work hard at stuff. We're serious about engaging the unbeliever. As time went on, there was greater clarity about what we were trying to do. So, for example, in our small group program for our young workers, our 20-somethings, we reckoned if we've got them for 5 years, let's have a 4-year training program. So in other words, let's cover off 4 major books in the time that they're with us. Let's give them the gospel. So actually they did get to know Mark. Let's give them Romans, so they get some theology and with a heart for the lost from Romans. Then we used to go to Exodus, so they understand salvation in particular, begin to think about issues of biblical theology. And then let's do 1 Corinthians, because, you know, if it's, you know, the truth is 1 Corinthians is London, Corinth is London. There are all the ethical issues you could want to cover off there. So that was one thing. I think we were then intentional about men's and women's ministries in the last couple of years of wanting to raise the game for our guys. So in other words, give them a passion for either ministry or eldership. So guys with real ability, you want to say, actually, do you know what, I think God has gifted you, and I think you do need to think through the issue whether you should be serving the Lord full-time in gospel ministry. But if that's not for you, that's okay. But it could well be that you serve as an elder. So let's give you some input here. And we used to have early morning Bible studies at 6:30 for a small group of guys. Looking, first of all, in the first term at biblical masculinity. Second term, we look at Philippians, so they understand biblical partnership. And then sort of moving them through into running groups and that kind of stuff.
Okay, so are they getting skills in lots of things there, including the idea of being able to open the Bible with others, whether you're equipping them for full-time ministry or eldership. Yep.
Yeah.
And what resource?
And in small groups sometimes. So particularly one-to-one. So one of the things we failed to do but tried to do was to give all of our guys, men and women, confidence to open a gospel and do one-to-one Bible studies. So one of the things that's been hugely successful over here is the thing called Uncover, which has worked really well amongst the student population. And we've tried to sort of climb off the back of that and say, honestly, there's nothing magical about Uncover. It's a gospel with some really impressive graphics, but actually, you're perfectly capable of sitting down with your friend in Costa and saying, look, let's look at Mark 1 together. What do you make of that? What do you think? What's he trying to do here? How do you respond? So yeah, we wanted, because of the guys that we were working with. So look, overwhelmingly, our congregation was full of people who were educated to tertiary level. That's all. That's a real oddity, but it's where we were. And I'd have slightly different ambitions in a different context. But for us, that was the right thing to do.
Okay, that's helpful. Really helpful, actually. We haven't got much more time, and so if people on the webinar want to ask questions, now's the time to get in quick. Would be a good thing to do. But Reuben, do you have any thoughts on that question as well? What are the specific ways, apart from the sermon, how are you training people, and what are you training them? What are you equipping them to do?
So it's interesting just hearing Perk's reflection on the beginning, not being well thought through on some of the training stuff, but actually teaching people almost just by the experience of being part of the new church, lots of what it means to be a disciple of the local church. I think that one of the things that we have sought to do more intentionally from the outset has been something like that. And so we have a thing we call TW training, and twice a year we stop our small groups and we all meet together centrally, and you can choose one of 3 streams. One is a Bible handling stream, one is a doctrine stream, and one is a engaging the culture stream. It's sort of evangelism training, but it's a bit more than that. It's sort of biblical theology of culture / engaging / bringing the gospel to bear in this kind of way. And everybody in the church, well, all our members went through that twice last year, which meant that they got 2 of those streams, and that was successful. We're going to run it again. In fact, next month is when the next one is. That
sounds really interesting and transferable. For the uncreative, busy Australian church planner, what resources did you draw on for those courses? Did you write your own?
Yeah. So I taught the doctrine one on union with Christ. My assistant taught the Bible handling one, and a keen guy in our church who's at theological college taught the other one. So I had done some work on union with Christ before, and was able to sort of rework that. Yeah, I lent on others. So, but there are loads of resources for that kind of thing around.
We might even afterwards see if we can get some of those resources available if they're in a form that would work. But that's a really helpful thing. Questions come in.
One of the mistakes I made early on was coming out of theological college, wanting to write everything from scratch for myself. And actually, when you get busy, do you know what? Take down William Taylor's little commentary on Philippians, read it, use the questions in the back. It's pure gold. There's a kind of 8, 9, 10 week Bible study course, and it was just my pride that was getting in the way of using something really beneficial for others. And so, as Reuben says, there are great resources out there.
No, that's
if I can just quickly, Craig, it wasn't anything to do with my pride writing my own stuff. I can tell you, it was. I'm not trying to be clever at all, because I'm not.
Yeah, no, I totally get that. Questions come in about making use of theological colleges and outside theological training, with your sharp young graduates, does that have any place for you in equipping people?
So
You mean sending them off to...
Or doing some training part-time while they're with you, sending them off to theological training?
we sent a guy to Oak Hill last year, so he was kind of the first. We've talked from the beginning about being committed to trying to equip people to, raise up leaders and so on. And so he interned from the beginning with me, which sounds much more thought through than it was. I mean, he just basically hung out with me. I gave him a load of books to read. He wrote a paper on each chapter of these books, and we met once a week to discuss that. And he then has gone on to Oak Hill. So that would be my preferred option, but it's not going to be feasible for everybody simply because of the cost. And so there are other avenues that we might use, but we don't have anybody in training at the minute. Sure. Richard?
Best ministry training is to be had in a church plant. That's slightly overstated, but honestly, I was Robin to Richard was Batman for the first 3 years down at Dundonald. I learned so much before theological college. There was no training program. He had nothing on paper. I just hung around, carried his bag, talked to him, listened to everything he did, and he, out of necessity, had to get me to do some stuff. Threw me in at the deep end. I just about swam. We got away with it. People want to go to the big churches to get the brilliant training experience. They just miss out on a wealth of hands-on ministry experience that you get in a local church plant. So my consistent recommendation to guys thinking about planting is do it, and my recommendation to people who are planters is get one, because you want to. It's almost as though when we go to Peckham, Nigel and I want to be planting pregnant, to use Ed Stetz's phrase. We want a guy in situ who spends the first 2-3 years with us, so that the Lord willing, if we're able to plant, we've got our guy and he's good to go from day one.
So we have some stats on that in the Australian context as well, where one of the real predictors of a church planter surviving and thriving is that at some time in the past, he's had the experience of being in a church plant, often as a young bloke, just, rank and file, part of the congregation, but just being there, seeing it, being part of that has equipped him. Yeah, it seems to be a better predictor of him doing well than what theological training he gets, that kind of thing. Yeah. Well, we're almost out of time. I wanted to ask you guys about the city being a multiculturally diverse, how that might be a challenge. But any quick thoughts on that? Unless there's something else you really want to say we haven't had a chance to say.
London City Mission did a report, I think, back in 2012, so 5 years ago. Their observation was that the church in London has grown over a 7-year period between 2005 and 2012. And the two single biggest contributory factors to that were the growth of black majority churches, which are overwhelmingly Pentecostal, and church planting amongst immigrant communities. So that you could be provocative and say the future of Christianity in this country is probably foreign in London, and it's been good. And I think anecdotally amongst the commission congregations, the people we're seeing where there's real traction with the gospel often are the internationals, for whom there is, particularly perhaps the first generation lot, who come over and there's a sense of, what am I doing here? And there's an openness to relationships. There's perhaps an openness to new ideas, and we're seeing the gospel gain traction there.
So immigration into your culture is not necessarily a threat for the gospel, but an opportunity for the gospel. Open
the nations are coming to London. It's extraordinary.
Reuben, any thoughts on the multicultural diversity of London? How are you guys approaching that? How's that shaping what you're doing?
Two things. I think, first of all, I would concur with Perks in terms of getting the people we got traction with quickest, earliest. In fact, I think maybe, well, certainly most of the people that have been converted are from non-Anglo cultures. And interestingly, we've had a couple of people recently converted from Ethiopia. And I heard somewhere that the Lord is doing something in Ethiopia. I think he's working amongst Ethiopian people, which is wonderful. But so here's what I can't get I don't know what to think about this. When we talk about engaging the culture, even in a place like Shepherd's Bush, there are multiple cultures, and what does it look? It's, you know, to engage Shepherd's Bush requires us to engage like double figures of different cultures, very distinct cultures that have very little overlap. So, as a white man, with all of the things that characterize me, I suppose, you know, there are lots and lots of things about who I am that make it impossible for me to connect culturally with different kinds of people. So I keep saying this to our church, that we need to pray the Lord will raise up increased diversity in our congregation, so that the congregation, you know, that we're there to equip the saints to do the work of ministry, and so we want to see a more diverse congregation that will reach then a more diverse breadth of cultures, even just here on the doorstep. So what are we doing about that? To be honest, the thing that we're doing that I think is going to be the only thing that's of any value is praying. We're praying that the Lord will send us people from different contexts, different backgrounds, who will have a real passion to reach the different communities in this area, because I can't do it all on my own. The elders can't do it all on their own. Even our church as it is today can't do it all on its own. So, yeah.
Yeah, it sounds like, I mean, if you pray that way, if your congregation prays that way, then that's going to shape how you respond when those people walk in the door. How you welcome them. It's going to give them a hunger for those people to be involved in leadership and ministry, rather than the Anglos keeping. Yeah, so sounds like a great place to start. Yeah, guys, we're just about out of time. I think there's another question, but I just don't. We're not going to get to those questions. Can I just say, as I have a role in a church in a city context in Australia, in Sydney, so much of this has been right on the money, really helpful in thinking about how we reach cities. And you've served our listeners in the webinar really well. So really want to thank you for your honesty, your insights. That's been massively helpful. So thanks very much. And I think I'm throwing back to Gus now.
Yeah, thanks, Craig. Yeah, thanks, Craig. Thanks to our panelists, Richard and Reuben, guys. Thank you very much for joining us. Morning our time, but I think we've just ticked over to midnight your time. So thank you very much, guys. It's been really invaluable. It's great to learn from your wisdom, your experience, but also great to learn from one another in both of our different contexts, and to encourage one another as we go forward and want to see the gospel reached out into our cities. So thanks, guys, very much. And thank you to you, wherever you happen to be joining us from, watching the webinar this morning. It's been great to have you join us. Now, if you missed a section this morning, or you had to drop out for a bit, or you'd like to kind of share what you've heard with others, this morning's webinar has been recorded, so you can see that up online towards the end of this week on the Geneva Push website, and it's also going to be on YouTube. And if you want to do it this, you can check out all of our previous webinars there on the website, ready to have a look. A final thank you to EA Insurance for their support of these webinars. They've been really invaluable. Jump on their website if you are thinking through church insurance needs. And just a quick plug for our next webinar that's coming up. We have got Ed Stetzer and Raj Gupta on the topic of church growth. So Scott Sanders is going to be interviewing them on the 15th of November. So make sure you jump onto the Geneva website, register for that now so you don't forget. And that is all for us this morning, or this evening if you happen to be in London. So thanks again for joining us. The recording will be up at the end of this week. Thanks again to Reuben and to Richard, and it's been great to have you join us. Enjoy the rest of your day. We'll finish off the webinar for now. Cheers, guys.